The topic of this screencast are the different types of water resources that are found on Earth. And the key underlying theme here is that water is abundant, but usable water is rare. 70% of the Earth's surface is actually covered in water. 70%. But most of that water is ocean water, and it's not usable in the ways that plants and animals and humans in particular are able to use it. We can't drink salt water. Think of the phrase, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. So let's take a look at how the various resources are divided up, keeping in mind that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered with water. So we have 70% of the Earth's surface being covered in water, and of that amount of water that's shown in this entire pie chart on the left, 97% of that 70% is ocean water, which is salt water, which means we can't use it for drinking, and most plants can't use it for obtaining water. Of that 70% of the Earth that's covered with water, only less than 3% of that water is fresh water. Fresh water means that it does not contain so much salt that we can't drink it. I do want you to remember that number, that of all the water on Earth, only less than 3% is fresh water. If we further break down that 3%, the picture is even worse. You can see that 77% of that 3% is locked in ice and glaciers, so currently we can't use it. Water bodies on the surface of the Earth, things like lakes and streams and ponds that you think of typically and you might have thought made a big number, were only 0.5% of this entire 3%. Atmospheric water, which is stuff like humidity, etc., that's in the air, is also very tiny relative to the other sources, and it's 0.03%. There is one other source of water, below ground water, also known as aquifers, which constitutes 22% of the fresh water that's available on Earth. And this is important to us and many coastal communities, and also in our food production across the Great Plains, because we rely on that below ground water for agriculture and for household use and industry. So we're going to look at all of the different types of water that are found on the surface or below ground. And the first one, and most important to us, is groundwater. You can see I have several definitions here on the left. We'll come back to those. First, please focus on the picture to the right. Here in this picture, you can see a house with a yard around it, and a little stream coming down here and a hillside with some trees. Immediately underneath the grassy lawn, you can see soil. And below that, you can see water. So the way it is on Cape Cod is that we have a very little topsoil, and then we have a very sandy soil here. When it rains, the rain comes down from the sky and lands on the grass, or when it snows, eventually the snow melts. That water percolates through our sandy soil layer here. And at the top, where it's shown in brown, there are different air pockets in between the different pieces of soil of different size particles. And when you get to a certain depth, called the water table, the rainwater and snow melt completely displaces any air pockets in the water, in the soil. So you end up with what's called an unconfined aquifer. So going back up to our definitions here, an aquifer are small underground spaces within permeable layers of rock and sediment where water is found. Permeable meaning that the water can percolate in between the layers of rock and sediment. And it needs to be, even though they're small spaces, it exists in significant quantities enough that we can use that water to supply water to our towns and for agriculture and industry. Here on Cape Cod, we have what is called an unconfined aquifer. That's the second term on your list. An unconfined aquifer means that the rainwater and snowmelt is free to just percolate down through the soil. And in our case, it percolates through quite quickly because of the amount of sandy soil that we have. So we have an unconfined aquifer. In some areas of the United States and the world, people have confined aquifers, and that's shown down here a little further on the graph. In the case of a confined aquifer, there is a layer of impermeable, impenetrable rock that covers the vast majority of the aquifer, and it only has a very small area which is not confined by this rock, and it has its recharge area meaning the area which will refill or recharge this confined aquifer. This can be important in places like the Great Plains, where we have the largest aquifer in the United States. It's called the Ogallala Aquifer, and it provides all of that water that we use for irrigating our crops, and it doesn't recharge very quickly. In fact, some of the water in there in the confined aquifers can be 10 or 20,000 years old, and even longer, sometimes even 1,000,000 years old. So it's very limited in its ability to recharge once we use it. Okay, a couple of things can happen. The next vocab term on your list here are springs. Springs occur when you have an unconfined aquifer where some of the pressure in some of the aquifer is so close to the surface that the water springs right up to the surface. And that can happen here on the Cape. That's why some of the basements, for example, in the Yarmouth Port area often flood, because spring water just comes right up. So water in an unconfined aquifer is very important to the plants and animals. So, for example, the plant roots can extend down into the unconfined aquifer or into areas where the soil is highly penetrated with water to obtain water for their photosynthesis. Likewise, springs are also important to animals, for example, that might rely on them as a water source. The last term on our list here is artesian wells. The last term on the list here is artesian wells. So artesian wells only occur when you have a confined aquifer. In the confined aquifer, there's a great deal of pressure because of this overlying layer of rock and the continual addition of a small amount of water. So when you have that condition, when you have a confined aquifer, if you put a well down there, the water from the great pressure that's existing here just shoots right up and does not need to be pumped up. When you have an unconfined aquifer, as we have here with wells on the Cape, you usually have to have some type of system to pump the water from the aquifer up to the surface where it's being used. Next, we'll look more closely at aquifers such as ours, which are unconfined aquifers, and we'll find out what happens when water is pumped out of that aquifer. So, what happens in short is this vocabulary term. A cone of depression is formed. This is an area where there is no longer any groundwater. So first, let's take a look at the picture on the left. So you have an area of land with soil underneath and nothing blocking the water from recharging. So the rain has come down, or the snowmelt has come down and displaced the air pockets in the soil here. Eventually, all of the air pockets are displaced and there's only water-saturated soil. The upper level of that is called the water table. So when you have a well, for example, for a town or maybe even an individual well, and the well pumps out water from this area here, the water table gets lower in an inverted cone type shape. So that means there's no longer saturated water here, only down here. So that's fine when you have a low level of pumping. When you have heavy pumping, let's say you have a major farm or a municipality pumping out more water than maybe they should be, you get a deeper cone of depression. And that lowers the water table so that the shorter wells run dry. They can no longer access the water table. And you can't just stop pumping and let the water refill. Once you have a well that's gone dry, it's essentially ruined and you need to have a new one. So this is not a good situation, and this is a situation where our towns and cities monitor the amount of water withdrawn, especially during periods of low precipitation, so that we can make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. You've probably heard about water restrictions, maybe people being allowed only even number houses being able to water their lawns one day, and odd numbered houses get to water their lawns another day, or even restrictions where they're not allowed to water a lawn at all. Here on the Cape, we have a special problem if we withdraw too much water, and we'll take a look at that in the next slide. So first, focus your attention on the vocabulary term for this slide, which is saltwater intrusion. The definition of saltwater intrusion is pumping of fresh water out of a well exceeds the recharge rate. This is a problem for coastal areas, which causes water to infiltrate the aquifer. So next, let's look at what that means. Turn your attention to the diagram down here. Pretend this is Cape Cod. Here we have the surface of the land, the underlying soil, and eventually we have a water table, which is under which the soil is totally saturated with water. Now you'll notice this water table has kind of a funny shape. It initially starts out with a shape we call a lens. A lens would be somewhat even along here, shaped like a contact lens, for example, and then again going down below it, again, just like a contact lens. But when we have, excuse me, So we have this lens of water, fresh water sitting here, and it floats on ocean water. And the only thing separating the fresh water, which is floating on top of the salt water, is a very, very minuscule difference in their density. Salt water is slightly more dense, so over time it sank, and the fresh water being less dense over time formed a freshwater lens just resting on top. There's no rock barrier in between the two. They just sit there, have formed over millions of years based on density. So as you can see, what happens in that type of situation, you not only get a cone of depression when you pump, but you also get a cone of ascension, and that's pulling the salt water in to the fresh water. And when that happens too quickly, the saltwater and freshwater density barrier breaks and saltwater intrusion occurs. Saltwater intrusion means that the salt water rushes into the fresh water and mixes with the fresh water, and it will take thousands and thousands of years for it to separate out. So if this happens, your freshwater groundwater is ruined for a very, very long time. So we'll look more carefully at groundwater in lab, and we'll look more specifically at some of the issues surrounding groundwater, including pollution of groundwater, the saltwater intrusion issue, and some of the other issues. So please combine your lab information with your lecture information as you're responsible for both. So for now, that's all I'm going to say about groundwater, and now we're going to turn to surface bodies of water, and take a look at that. Actually, I've reached the time limit on this recording, so we will turn to surface water in a separate recording.